small piece of what I do here with the Bible. That'll help you to understand more of this part that you support when you donate to my ministry. So my time is dedicated to two things. One is preaching the gospel to the Ukrainians. So I meet with people and I talk with them about Jesus and present them the gospel message and make a call for them to become Christians and help them in forming their walk in Christ. That's my work in Ukraine. Now, some people that I meet with are already Christians, but they have never been discipled. And so I also disciple. But most of what I do is preaching the gospel to those who haven't heard or don't understand it. The other part of what I do is translating the Bible. Now, a lot of you think I'm just translating the Old Testament, but no, I'm translating the whole Bible. The Old Testament for the rooted word, that's the name of the translation, TRW, just like KJV is King James Version, TRW is the rooted word. So you see TRW Precise English and TRW Common English. Those are two different editions of the same Bible. One is for technical work of pastors and teachers who do not have access to Greek. They don't understand Greek, they haven't studied Greek, and so they can read that in English and get as close to the Greek, the original Greek, as possible in English. The second edition, called the Common English Edition, is then a revision of the Precise English Edition into common spoken English, so it's accessible to the general public. And we change as little as necessary in order to achieve that. So that's also as close as possible to the Greek while still being readable in English. Now, you say, oh, okay, well, you're translating the Bible. There are a lot of translations and a lot of people do that, yes. Well, number one, a lot of people who do it are not qualified, okay? I've had years of Greek, both classical Greek and biblical Greek, in addition to biblical Hebrew. Although I'm not translating from Hebrew because I use the Septuagint, which is LXX. You'll see this abbreviation sometimes. And that is the Greek Old Testament. It's 1,100 years older than the Hebrew Old Testament. You see, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because the Hebrews around 900 AD destroyed as many Hebrew manuscripts as they could get their hands on, so that theirs that they were producing in 900 AD would be the only surviving manuscripts. So that's why. It's the fault of the Hebrews, the Jews, who were the leaders at the time in 900 AD. So we use the Greek Old Testament, but in the New Testament, we use what's called the Byzantine text. And you don't have to know what these mean, but the Byzantine text is what nearly all manuscripts for the New Testament are of Byzantine origin. And so it represents well over 90% of the manuscripts out there. Now, this may be too technical for some of you, and some of you may be going, well, what does this have to do with my Christian walk? I don't really care. But you should really go ahead and watch the rest of the video because it's quite interesting, and I'm going to show you original manuscripts so you can get an idea of what it looks like and what we're facing. And I'll explain why also. So right now, what we're looking at is an article, and I want to read this to you as you read along with me here, and you'll get a feel for what we're facing. Some notes on the earliest manuscripts, on the earliest manuscript one of Paul's letters. Now, I turned to this article because I was sitting here reflecting on, well, why does Codex B, that's the Codex Vaticanus, that's the oldest Bible in existence, why is it missing Philemon, Titus, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy? They're all missing from it. I'm thinking, well, why is it missing? I mean, we're already into the 300 AD mark with this Codex B. So we're talking about 250 years afterwards, maybe 250, 200 years afterwards. If they existed, they should be there. So why aren't they there? So let's go ahead and have a look at this article. The publication of P46, that's a number for a manuscript, like an ancient writing of some place in the New Testament or Bible in general. The publication of P46, P stands for papyrus. That means it was written on paper made from some reeds of a plant in Egypt. And then later they started using what's called velum, which is the skin from young calves, animals. And they'd write on that because the papyrus would decay quickly. In fact, today, if you look at a papyrus, then you will see that it's in pieces, fragments. But if it's whole, it's still missing parts off of it because it decayed. Even while we're trying to preserve it in a controlled environment, it still decays. So papyrus was replaced by vellum because they recognize the endurance of the vellum. So when you get to vellum, it's in quite good condition. Except for maybe the ink, okay? So P stands for papyrus. When you see a number for manuscript and it says P something, it means papyrus. The publication of P46 in 1936 to 37, then and now the oldest extant manuscript of Paul's epistles. Extant means existing. The oldest existing manuscript of Paul's epistles has not ceased to pique the interest of biblical scholars, beginning with the plates and text published by Kenyon. Plates are photographic plates, 1936 and 37, and continuing with the virtual birth of reasoned eclecticism with Zundt's magisterial, the text of the epistles, a disquisition on the Corpus Paulinum, 1953. It's just a book. And reconsiderations of its date, the date of the papyrus. And where's the end of that? All right. This priceless document, the P46, has made its way to the front lines of biblical scholarship for a long time. Though Kim's suggestion that Chester Beatty Biblical Papyrus II was written before the reign of Domitian, that's 81 to 96 AD, some call it CE. I disagree with Christians using that because you're caving into the world who wants to eradicate Christianity from our culture. It's been refuted, the suggestion that it's written before this time. The consensus continues that it was produced around 200 AD. Now, you're saying, so what does this have to do with me, right? Well, this part, not much, okay? But I want to expose you to the field that I'm facing when I'm looking at manuscripts and making decisions and translating. Now, eclecticism is what I criticize quite often. And it's where they piece something from here, something from there, something, and they make their own Frankenstein Bible. And they say, well, this is the closest to the original manuscript we can get. And each one of them has a different version of what they think is the original manuscript, pieced together by their imagination. And they may take a papyrus like this and only choose one verse out of it and put that in instead of the whole papyrus. They're not making a decision on the document. They're making a decision on the contents of the document and accepting some of it and rejecting some of it based on their own personal, human, limited reasoning. And that's what I disagree with. Now, if you're working with a document, like I'm working with Codex B, this is the Codex Vaticanus, and there are missing parts due to some accident, like the first 48 chapters of Genesis were lost in a fire. And so those were replaced around the 14th or 15th century by another scribe. So those chapters are not from 300 AD. Those are from 1,000 or 1,100 years later. So I look for a second manuscript that is the oldest representation of Genesis that I can find. And then I use the text from that in those first 48 chapters as I'm translating the Codex B. But there's also a note saying why, that these folios, these pages, were burned in a fire and replaced 1,000 years later or more. And so we've used this manuscript, which is dated at this date, in order to represent these 48 chapters of Genesis. Where are the pastoral epistles? One curiosity of this papyrus is that, in its current state, it lacks the pastoral letters. Now, the pastoral letters of Paul are Titus, 1 Timothy, and 2 Timothy. Okay? With 86 of the original 104 leaves still extant, that means existing, scholars have a good amount of material to work with as to whether it would have originally contained the pastorals. You say, how can they figure out if it would have originally contained? Well, he goes into some details here, and I want you to hear this so you understand the difficulties that are being faced and what men are trying to achieve with their knowledge of what they're looking at. Some of it's brilliant, Some of it is pure speculation, and you need to separate the two. I only accept the stuff that is not speculation. Any speculation whatsoever, I throw out, and that's rightly so. How do they know that it originally contained 104 leaves? If it only has 86, how do they know there were 104 leaves? Now, a leaf is like this. You got, and it's sewn in the middle and it's folded, right? That's one leaf. Whereas this is a page, and this is a page. And then on the back is a page, and on the back is a page. So you've got 4 pages on one leaf. And they're not consecutive. Because if you've got this page, this leaf, and you got 10 more on top of it, well, this page and this page are not going to be related to each other. Because you got 10 more leaves on top of it that fold up. So you see how that works. And the same is true with the back, right? The back will be related to the front on this side, and same over here, but neither one of those backer fronts are related to the other backer fronts unless you're at the middle of the book. All right, that's what a leaf is. So how did they know there were 104 leaves when they only have 86 that are existing? 2 features are used to infer this. First, the manuscript is a single quire codex. This means that all the double leaves, or bifolia, were laid down on top of each other. Just like I said, it's a bifolia, right? And so it's laid down on top of each other, then folded and sewn into the binding. The fact that it was a single quire codex can be detected by size of the pages. Moving from the beginning to leaf 52, the pages get increasingly narrower. The physical pages are getting narrower as you're going from this here up to the middle, right? Then from leaf 53 to the end, it gets increasingly wider. So the ones on the bottom are wider and the ones on the top are narrower. Why would that be? This can only mean that all the bifolia were laid down in one stack, folded, and when you fold them, the middle ones are going to be sticking out further. You say, why? Because the outer ones have to enfold around the whole stack. So you got whatever thickness it is of the folia here that it has to actually get around. So they're going to actually not stick out as much as the middle ones. Middle ones will stick out a lot. And so then they have to be trimmed. So they all are even here when they're closed. Then when you open them, the middle ones will be actually narrower and they'll lie on top. And so you'll have a cascading effect of the pages. This can only mean that all the bifolia were laid down in one stack, folded, then trimmed on the outside so that all the leaves are relatively flush. The latter, standard quire, was 8 leaves or 4 double leaves used throughout the early to Middle Ages. So it's not that. Okay. So already you can see that actually is quite brilliant to recognize that. And that's not conjecture. That's not speculation. That's actually physical practice, and you can physically see that with the leaves. Second, each page is numbered by the original scribe. This is unusual for manuscripts of any age. Usually the quires are numbered, and frequently the leaves were numbered on the front page, but not the pages. So on one page. Since the first extant page is numbered 17, folio 8, and starts with Romans 5:17, we can extrapolate that the manuscript began with Romans 1 and is missing the outer 7 double leaves. What is extant are 9 Pauline letters. Romans, this is what exists in this. Romans, Hebrews, almost always included in the Pauline corpus as far as ancient manuscripts are concerned. I would argue with that. So Hebrews is at the end of the Pauline epistles, just before the Apocalypse of John. So that doesn't mean it was included with the Pauline epistles. It's ambiguous because it's at the end of those and before John. Because if you reason that way, then the Apocalypse was written by Paul also, which we know is not true. So first off, I want to address this where they say that it starts with Romans 5:17, but we can extrapolate that the manuscript began with Romans 1. We can't, because there are no verse numbers. The verse numbering, the versification, was created around the time of the Reformation. So not even close. We're talking about 1,300 years later, 1,200 years later. So there are no verse numbers. There were rarely any chapter indications. And if there were, they were different from what we have today. But actually in 200 AD, there wouldn't have been chapter divisions. So there's no chapter divisions, there's no versifications. You find some chapter divisions in the late 300s, around 400. You may see some other markings of divisions in the margins. But we don't know that it's Romans 5:17. I mean, we can see the text is the same as what we have as Romans 5:17. But we don't know that the letter didn't start there or only had a few words before of greeting. So we don't know that Romans 1, 2, 3, and 4 were part of this papyrus. We're only assuming that it was. Now, it's a reasonable assumption, but it's not a conclusive one. We don't know that. So it is speculation. Although it's reasonable speculation, it's still speculation. So I still put that out. I say, no, this document starts with Romans 5:17. We don't know what came before that. It may have been a completely different text than what we see as Romans 1, 2, 3, and 4. We don't know. So then it says, what's extant is Romans, Hebrews, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians. Missing are 2 Thessalonians, Philemon, and the pastoral letters. Almost surely, notice how they say almost, but then they put surely. Almost surely, 2 Thessalonians followed 1 Thessalonians. We don't know that. We absolutely don't know that. It says, as it does all other manuscripts which have both letters. Well, all other manuscripts which have both letters, certainly second follows first. But you see the shell game they just played on you. First off, they put almost surely, which the surely cancels out the almost. That's why that phrase is used. 2 Thessalonians followed 1 Thessalonians, and they used followed rather than was included in the papyrus. And they're doing that in order to get you to say, well, of course, it follows 1 Thessalonians because 1 is before 2, right? That's what you do in your head without even thinking about it. As it does in all other manuscripts which have both letters. Notice the which have both letters. Well, yeah, if it has both letters, then 2 Thessalonians will follow 1 Thessalonians. But that doesn't say anything about whether this has both letters. And so they're playing a shell game with you. This guy is dishonest, like most academics are in this field. A lot of them are false teachers and sit under false teachers. And if you knew who this was, you would know that he is from Dallas Theological Seminary, one of the nests of false teachers. Actually, a nest of heretics because they believe in the pre-tribulation rapture. All right, let's go on though. But what about Philemon? Most scholars are of the opinion that Philemon was also included in this codex. Why? But the pastorals, this is where opinions have varied. Remember, pastorals are Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Kenyon started the ball rolling with the suggestion that the last 5 leaves were left blank and did not include the pastorals. The argument is that there was simply not enough room to include the pastorals and Philemon, which would require about twice as many leaves. Why would this be the case? Was the scribe unaware of them? If he was, this might suggest that they are not authentic. So this is why this is important, is that this may impact our reception of those letters as part of canon. That's what you hear in this, is that they're trying to make decisions about what the canon is and make arguments about that among themselves. Well, this isn't really canon, and so we really shouldn't be using this in the church. That's what they're doing. Although Kenyon's view held sway for many decades and is even now occasionally affirmed, Jeremy Duff's article in the New Testament Studies, P46 and the Pastorals, a Misleading Consensus, ? Challenged this hypothesis. One of the points made by Duff is that the letters are more compressed at the end of the codex than in the middle. Hang in there, because there's a huge surprise here at the end. One of the points made by Duff is that the letters are more compressed at the end of the codex than in the middle. He noted that there are half again as many letters per page in the last leaves than in the middle leaves. So half again as many means 50% more at the end than in the middle leaves. Well, the middle leaves are narrower, right? There's less room. But this is partially due to the fact that the outer leaves are wider than the inner leaves. Nevertheless, there are more letters in the back outer leaves than in the front outer leaves. So if you compare, here are the leaves, right, laid down. If you go down here to where they're bigger leaves, there are still more letters on this side than are on this side. This is the beginning of the manuscript. This is the end of the manuscript, and there are more letters here per page than over here, even though the pages of the folios are the same size at this point. Nevertheless, there are more letters in the back outer leaves than the front outer leaves, showing that at least some compression did take place, like pushing them together. And this seems to suggest that the scribe was aware of the problem he had created for including the pastorals, and he began to compensate upon realizing his mistake. Well, we don't know that. Could just be that he was towards the end and he didn't want to run out of room of what he had. And if there are some folios that are blank, well, we don't know that they were blank, but if there are some that are blank, then he succeeded. There are problems with Duff's analysis, however. The scribe seemed to understand to some extent how much space it would require to produce his codex. Notice the seemed, okay? And yet, even though it's seemed, he goes to great detail of explaining this. This is seen in his notes at the end of each book of how many lines he wrote. This was customary for professional scribes. It was in essence a bill for services, since they were paid by the line. He may have been working from a manuscript that had already indicated the number of lines, and thus, notice the would, may have, now he goes would have. It's all speculation. He starts out with speculation the scribe seemed to understand. Then he says he may have been. Then he says thus would have known. It's all speculation. You've got to pay attention to language when you're reading these kind of things. He may have been working from a manuscript that had already indicated the number of lines and thus would have known how many leaves he needed for his manuscript. Of course, the fact that his words were more compressed at the end of the codex seems to show that as careful as he was in his calligraphy, and he was, this tells us nothing about his math skills. He's a scribe. It's what he does for a profession. The basic math skills required for calculating that are basic to being a scribe. So that's ridiculous. That's absurd. To suggest that the math skills required in scribal practices as a professional scribe, and he says right here, show that as careful as he was in his calligraphy, and he was, and that he's a professional, counting up the lines to be paid per line. All right, this is where it gets really interesting. A fresh examination of the Codex. This week I had the privilege of examining P46 in the flesh. 56 of the 86 leaves are housed in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. You say, hold on, 56 of the 86, where are the other 30? I have the same contention, is that a lot of these you'll find are separated out geographically. Now, the Codex B is maintained in one location in the Vatican Library. But the Codex Sinaiticus, which I completely reject because it's a forgery, it still smells of a forgery, and there is this scandal around it of being a forgery. So whether we know it's a forgery 100% or we only look at it and we say, well, it might be, it still has to be rejected because of that. But the Sinaiticus is spread out. It's not in one location. Parts here, parts there, parts there. I think 3 different places. We're talking about manuscripts of the Bible. And yet they can't agree to put it in one place. And some say, well, that's better anyway, because if that place got destroyed in war, then at least we have some parts of that manuscript or codex still surviving. Well, there is that, right? But we should be more careful about evacuating things that are so ultimately precious as the Bible in times of war, and put it in a fallout shelter with controlled environment, of course. I have spent the last 3 days examining them in some detail, comparing them with the Editio Princeps by Kenyon. Sir Frederick Kenyon produced the plates, the photographic plates, of this famous papyrus in 1937. Each image has been assumed to be exactly the same size as the actual leaf it represents. This is where it gets interesting. I measured each leaf against Kenyon's plates and noticed some interesting phenomena. Of the 88 plates, 44 leaves, I was able to measure the plates in Kenyon's volume are off at least 61 times. So 44 leaves he photographed twice. So he's got 88 plates. 61 times out of 88, that's 75% of the time, the plates do not represent the size of the actual part of the leaf that was photographed. Most of these are within 1 millimeter or so, so that could be due to error, his measuring error. But a few are fairly significant. At least 3 are off by 3 millimeters, and 1 is off by as much as 5 millimeters. The 1 millimeter is a bit more than error, so there is some difference there. But the 3 millimeters and the 5 millimeters, it only accounts for 4 of the plates. This is not significant, but it's interesting. In addition, I noticed a curiosity. Some of the plates in Kenyon's volume were photographed without the lens plane exactly parallel to the leaf. What do you mean the lens plane? Well, when you have a camera, the plane of the lens is the plane, the imaginary plane that goes right through the lens, exactly parallel to the lens, not like this, not like that, not like that, but parallel. And so that has to be exactly parallel with the page in order to represent the size and the shape of the page precisely. But the page has to be lying flat. And that plane of the page has to be lined up in parallel with the plane through the photographic lens. Now, all of these things are very comfortable for me because I come from astrophysics and astronomy, starting from 11 years old, of starting to study it seriously. And when I went into university at 16 into astrophysics, they put me in the second year because of the years that I had studied it already independently. So for me, looking at these kinds of things about photographing in planes and lenses and things like that, it's just like, it's like putting my socks on, okay? For example, the photograph of folio 39 verso, you're going to see 2 words here, recto and verso, is right and left, or front and back. Recto can be right or front, and verso can be left or back. 1 Corinthians 1:14 through 23 is slightly wider than the actual leaf on the bottom. Okay? While the top of the leaf is the same size in both the photograph and actual manuscript. And leaves 49 recto, 1 Corinthians 10:1 through 10, and 50 recto, 1 Corinthians 10:21 through 30, and 51 verso, 1 Corinthians 10:31 through 11 and 6, are also somewhat trapezoidal. This suggests that the camera got caught, like knocked or something, or the tape around the plates holding the papyrus under the glass. It says right here, for Kenyon's photographs were of the papyrus under glass. Maybe the tape got doubled up, creating the trapezoidal effect. How much the incorrect sizes of the leaves in Kenyon's volume impact the discussion of whether P46 originally contained the pastorals is yet to be seen. But in the least, this anomaly needs to be factored into the discussion. Much can still be learned from this renowned papyrus. Now, if you're thinking like I'm thinking, you're saying, well, this shouldn't matter. Because what we're talking about is missing folios that are soon to be blank. So remember that he started by talking about how this starts in Romans 5. And so we're assuming that it goes back to Romans 1. And if it does, then that would, based on how many lines and letters they put on each page, at that part of the stack of folios, that would then represent about 7 pages or 7 folios that are missing sheets. So they're assuming there are 7 missing sheets. And they don't know what's on the last sheets. They don't know if maybe some of the pastoral epistles are on there, but not all. They don't know that. So they're assuming that all the pastoral epistles were accepted at the time as canonical and should have been included. And they're just ascribing this to the scribe's failure in calculating how much space he needed. But that doesn't explain why the 7 folios are missing. If there were 7 folios, and if they are missing. Very interesting. And so, of course, you may be thinking a couple steps ahead, especially if you're some chess master, saying, well, what are the last words in this manuscript? Does it conveniently end at the end of one of the letters? Or does it trail off in the middle of a letter? If it's in the middle of a letter, then obviously there are some folios missing. If it ends conveniently at the end of a letter, that may indicate strongly that there are no missing pages and that they had Romans starting in Romans 5:14 from the manuscript that he was working with, copying, if this was a copy. Now you see how this is very interesting. Now I'm going to whet your appetite a little bit more by showing you the actual manuscript. All right? This is what you waited for. This is what I'm giving you. Okay? So let's get on over there to the biblical manuscript. All right, here it is. This is the manuscript. You say, what in the world? Yeah, this is what happens to papyrus over time. This is why it was replaced by velum as a source material for writing on. Now, these photographs, you'll notice by the shape, you'll notice these are the same fragment, photographed in different ways, with black background, with white background. Very important, because some of these actually are more readable on black background and some on white. Now, I don't know who thought of that, but that was brilliant. So now we can have a closer look at this. You can see here, knowing Greek, I can make out some of the letters, like P-O-L-L-O, and some of them I can't. Like this, I don't know what this is. Right here, could be a C, could be an O, but that looks like an O. This is, so you can read some of the letters and some of them you can't. This is completely washed out. So good luck trying to reconstruct it, right? And you can see this is the middle where it was sewn, right here. You got text here and text here. So it's very interesting, yes? Now, if we look at, that was with black background. This is with white background. So for me, this one, some letters are more legible against the white background, some against the black. Now, if we scroll down over here, we see the next one. This is the next fragment. It looks more complete, although not complete. It's still missing a lot of things, right? And it looks like this is where it was sewn together, right here, where it broke. Which makes sense because it's folded there, which would weaken it. But you can see a lot more of the letters here, a lot more clearly. And then on white background here, for me, this is harder to read than the black background for this one. Now, if we scroll down, now what you'll notice also, let's go back up to the top. You notice at first this thing is jutting to the left. See that? It's like to the left, like that. But then as you go down, it juts to the right. And you say, well, why is that? Are they reversing the letters? No. This is the front. This is the back. So you notice this with each shape. This one here, you got this little jutting off over here to the left. Now it's over here to the right. Because this is the front, this is the back. And they do this with each fragment because there's writing on the front and on the back. So you got to see what's on the front and on the back. Okay. Now this here looks like this, this is this left half of this image, and this is the right half, which is what they've done all along up here as well. They will photograph it first, like up here, they'll photograph it first, then they'll photograph 2 halves of it. Then they'll photograph the white, so they got the black hole, then black half, white hole, white half, and then here's white hole again, I don't know why. All right, and so the same thing here. This is what the manuscript looks like. P46. Here's a rather complete page. I mean, it's not complete, but it's closer. And again, you can see it's weakened here where it was folded and sewn together. Okay, there's some designation at the top there. Now, if you look down here at the bottom, it says what the text is of Romans 11:3, 11:4, 11:5, 11:6, 11:7, 11:8, 11:9, 11:10, 11:11, and 11:12. So those are what you're seeing here. Then here on the right side of this same one, because see, this is one right here. Then they photographed the left side and the right side here. The right side is Colossians 1:16, 1:17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. So you had Romans on the left side and Colossians on the right side. That's because of the folios being stacked like this. So the left side and right side, like I said, are not going to be related to each other until you get to the middle. Now we've got it reversed here. So if we look at it close up, it says this is Romans 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and Romans 11, 1. And this is Philippians 4, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and Colossians 1 and 2. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at, now a lot of these, most of the pages are intact, okay? You can see that on this papyrus. Some of them are in devastating condition. But this one, you got a lot of text in here that is intact. And like here, this is legible. This is clearly legible. So that's what we're facing when looking at manuscripts for the Bible. And we're trying to figure out what is on that manuscript. I'll give you a sneak preview of what the Codex B looks like that I'm dealing with. Notice first, before we go there, that these are all capital letters. They're not small letters, although the A looks a little funky if you know what alpha looks like. The capital alpha looks quite a bit different than this, right? This is a bit stylized. Well, you have different styles of writing, like Coptic letters. You'll see that in the Codex B. When I show you that in just a minute, it's in Coptic style. Very different than this. But notice there are no spaces between the words. There are no periods. There are no commas. Nothing. It's just one long word to our eyes. There's no division between words. There was no convention such as the space to separate words. They didn't need that. They could look at the text and see the words. So now, this is from the Vatican Library. This is the Codex B, Codex Vaticanus. I'm going to try to show you here some of what we were just looking at. Let's go to Colossians 1502. All right, so this is what the oldest Bible in the world looks like. And we're looking at Colossians now. And for them, they actually wrote the name of the book here. Very nice. See how nice this is? Okay, you can see the folding and the stitching. So this is written on vellum. It's not papyrus, and that's why it's preserved so well. The ink is so readable because it was actually inked over at some point in its history. Now, they differ as to whether it was kept in southern Italy or Constantinople after it was moved from its origin. Some speculate it was in Egypt, the origin. And the reason is because of the Coptic style of letters. And Coptic was one of the languages from Egypt. So you've got the Coptic Church, which is headquartered in Egypt. So the Coptic letters are quite obvious. The A here looks a lot closer to the Greek capital A than in our other document that we're looking at, the papyrus. You'll notice there are also some other strange things like the C, capital C. Well, that's a sigma. It's called a lunate sigma. And it's one of the things that's unique about this manuscript, this codex. There's also this, which is omega, and if you know the capital Greek letters, that's not the capital omega in Greek, that's the small omega, but it's full size, full capital size letter, uppercase letter, but it's in the shape of the small. So that's also a very unique letter to this codex. Now you notice some marks here and there as well. They may have been added, actually. But there are some times when you will see behind the letters some other letters. Sometimes that's bleed through from the other side of the velum, the other side of the page. And sometimes it's written over. It was washed out and written over. So you will find that in the manuscript, and it's important to distinguish between the two. Then you'll see over here, like in this is interesting, where you've got the letters going, and then you got some tiny, tiny letters over here to finish the word. And over here too. And so you get that. I've noticed also, I don't know if it happens in the New Testament, because I don't use this for the New Testament, but the Old Testament, they'll have the L, and they'll have, not the L, they'll have the gamma. So the gamma, if there's an O before it, and it's over here on the end, they'll have a tiny O like this, nestled right in the crook of the gamma right here. And it's a separate letter, but it's, for some reason, shrunk down and stuck into, it may be a style of writing, like when I write and these two words occur simultaneously, like sequentially in the sentence, both and the, I will write B-O-T-H-E, a single word. And so I remember when that started happening, but I don't know why. But I liked it, and so I continued to do it. And that's how I hear it in my head anyway, both the. And so I write it that way. So there are personal conventions like that that get into the writing. Now here you'll notice it says up here, this is pros Colossae, and this is for the Colossians, okay, or for Colossae, the church of Colossae. And then you've got this big capital letter, which is pi. Probably noticed that from math. And that begins this first word. The word doesn't start with an alpha, it starts with a pi. And here they've got this nice bar that usually is full green. Obviously the color is washed off. And then these three crosses above it. And that is a division, a book division. So down here, this is for the Philippians. Okay, so they'll put the name of the book at the beginning and the end of the book so that you can see that it's the end in addition to this at the beginning. So it's quite interesting. Then you got other markings like this. Some correction, 19921502. Not sure. It looks more like an omega. All right, so very interesting. You'll see the Vatican image stamp. That's not on the actual manuscript. But there are some things on the manuscript like this stamp here. And also, when you get to the end, right here, you'll notice there are two stamps. One is for the Vatican, Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana. And then here you have Bibliothèque Nationale. You say, well, what is that? It sounds Spanish. It's French. Because this document was taken by Napoleon from the Vatican Library to Paris. It was kept there for some time and then returned. Now you're saying, what is that? This is the end of Revelation. And this is not in all capitals. You see that? It's in small letters. And you got a comma here and a comma here. This was written much later. This is not written at the time of this codex. This part, the Apocalypse, was written much later. None of it is in all capitals. So you know that that's not original to the manuscript. Now maybe it was in the manuscript originally, and it was part of the fire that burned Genesis. Because remember, they're laid down like this. And if the fire burned this part, maybe it burned this part too. And so both Genesis and the Apocalypse are replaced by this 14th or 15th century writing. that means that we don't know if this is representing it accurately or not, because the pages were already burned when this was written. So what were they writing this from? They obviously chose some manuscript to copy. So we don't know. Maybe they had a copy of the Codex somewhere and they wrote it from that. Or maybe they took this from another manuscript. We don't know. This is what I'm facing when I'm translating the Bible. Now you know the difficulties. I'm going to go back here to Genesis and show you. This is the very beginning of the Bible, and the oldest Bible that exists. This is actually an epsilon, which is the letter E. And you especially know because the first letter here is an N, a nu. And Genesis begins with N, arche, and then that means this has to be an epsilon, and it is. You can see it, it's stylized, but you can see here it goes like this, and there's the middle part here. A lot of viney type flowery parts. But that's what it looks like in Genesis. It's all small letters, and it's got some punctuation in it. Okay? But, for example, if I just scroll over a little bit and just pick something random, we're back into the capital letters. So you can see there's no punctuation. There's still some marks on the top. Like I said, those were likely added by the scribe who inked over it to make sure that it was still legible. And again, you can see some things that maybe bleed through or maybe corrections where it's washed out. Well, we know this is bleed through because this mark here in this bleed through is from left to right, not right to left. And so that's obviously an inverted image from the other side. Okay, so you can see that. That's what I'm dealing with in translating. And you can see sometimes they do have the chapter numbers, what they considered the chapters. So it might not correspond to our chapters, but not all of them have this. I'm going to show you what Daniel looks like here, because it is quite different than the rest. This is the page for Daniel, the beginning page. You can see Daniel here, Danila, and then you can see it's like boom, boom. This is, look at here, this is the ending of the previous book. This is the beginning of Daniel, right here. But look at all of this in the small letters that was written centuries after that fill up all of the blank space. Boy, they went crazy on this, didn't they? Look at that. It's like the whole page with these scribal notes. Now you notice here, there's a big beta. That's the second letter in Greek. And that would represent the second chapter. They numbered their chapters after the Greek letters. So here you've got an alpha. So their divisions, sometimes they did divisions. They marked it in the margin, and they would mark it with a capital Greek letter. It's not consistent, though. So you got to pay attention as you're translating. And this doesn't start out with what we have as Daniel. This starts out with Susanna and the elders, the two elders who wanted to rape Susanna. You probably don't know the story, do you? It's interesting that they excluded it from the Bible. The Protestants. Catholics have it, Orthodox have it, but the Protestants excluded this book that is only about two elders who were infatuated with lust for this married woman, tried to entrap her into having sex with them, threatening to defame her if she didn't. The two of them together would be witnesses to defame her if she wouldn't have sex with them. That's right. And Daniel came in and he tricked them into revealing their lie. All he had to do was separate them and ask them the story and the details. And they got into the details, they could see that it was a lie. Interesting that they should exclude that. But that was part of Daniel. That was how Daniel started. Now, some manuscripts put that at the end of Daniel, but Traditionally, it's at the beginning. And in ours, Daniel includes it. And there's another section that's excluded in the Protestant Bible as well, that we include. So it's quite interesting. I hope this piqued your interest, but this shows you when you donate to the ministry, what you're donating to. You're donating to the gospel being preached here in Ukraine, but you're also donating to the work of the translation of the Bible accurately, carefully, and without any kind of speculative decisions being made. So, again, if you will please consider in your heart donating a regularly monthly amount, I really need that to support me while I'm doing my work. I'm doing work of the kingdom each and every day with the skills that God has developed in me for a long time to prepare me for these works. And your donations are part of that work. So consider what you can give each month. Dedicate to giving that each month. Write me an email, ron.craig@therootedword.com, and say, I would love to support the ministry, and I'm going to dedicate this much monthly to supporting you in the work of God. You can go to the links down below in the description of any video, and you'll get there so you can donate. It's very simple, very quick. After you donate, you land on, it sends you to the page where you can sign up for the newsletter. And I highly recommend that if you donate, that you sign up for the newsletter. That way you can stay in touch with prayer requests, and what's going on here in Ukraine with the ministry and with the translation work, things that are important that happen, in addition to other financial needs that may arise. May the Lord bless you as you seek Him with all your heart.